The sun rose slow over the Texas plains, spilling gold across the wheat and dust, painting the clapboard rooftops of Dawson Hollow with morning mercy. In a sleepy town nestled between rolling fields and hard desert edges, folks moved at a rhythm passed down through generations, slow, deliberate, cautious. It was a place where folks knew each other's grandparents, and grudges lasted just as long. Caleb Booker was known simply as the widower. Folks dropped his first name the way they stopped asking if he'd ever remarry. He ran the only leather repair shop in town, tucked between the apothecary and the boarding house that hadn't seen a paying guest in 5 years. His hands were scarred and strong from years of saddle stitching, but his eyes, gray and worn, held the kind of sorrow that no stitching could mend. Each morning, he opened the shutters of his shop just as the church bell gave its first lazy clang. He'd light a stick of pine kindling, put on the same tan apron, and begin his quiet work. His life was clockwork: sunrise, stitching, supper, solitude. He didn't seek change, not after burying his wife 3 winters back. He lived small, careful, like a man afraid to take too much from a world that had already taken more than its share. But change has a way of arriving even in the most stubborn corners of the earth. It started with a sound, subtle, a child's cough, dry and raw, threading through the cracks in the alley wall behind his shop. He didn't move at first, just paused his needle mid-loop and listened. The sound came again, short, stifled, like someone trying not to be heard. Outside, Dawson Hollow looked the same. Sun-baked streets, cottonwood trees trembling in the wind, and townsfolk going about their day with a studied indifference. But beneath the surface was something meaner, a quiet hierarchy of blood and skin. White men ran the shops. Brown and black families lived on the edge of town, their children kept out of school under one excuse or another. Most townsfolk pretended it wasn't cruel, just the way things are. Caleb didn't talk much about race. Didn't have to. His late wife was half Choctaw, and that was enough to make some folks whisper. He knew what it meant to live on the frayed edge of belonging. As the cough behind the wall grew into a muffled sob, Caleb stood slowly, the worn-wood floor creaking beneath his boots. He set the half-finished saddlebag aside, pushed open the back door, and stepped into the alley. There, huddled in the shadows between a barrel and the rear wall, was a girl, barefoot, maybe 12. Her dress was torn, stained with dust and blood at the knees. Her skin was darker than his, but pale with exhaustion. She flinched when he approached, clutching a frayed burlap sack like it was the only thing she owned. Caleb didn't speak. He just knelt down, gently, and held out a cracked leather canteen. And just like that, the clockwork of his quiet life stopped ticking. She gave her name in a whisper that barely stirred the air between them. "Elsie," she said, voice rough as sand. "I ain't stole nothing. I swear." Caleb didn't press her. He offered a crust of cornbread and a place to sit in the shade of the workbench while he returned to his stitching, though his hands moved slower now, more deliberate. Elsie sat curled in a corner of the shop, eyes darting toward every creak of floorboard, every gust of wind that stirred the dust outside. She was skittish, like an animal too long hunted. By sundown, she was asleep beside the wall, her burlap sack folded beneath her head like a pillow. Caleb draped a wool blanket over her small frame and sat on the stoop outside, staring down the street as shadows lengthened. Something was wrong. He didn't need full proof to feel it. She hadn't run, hadn't even asked for help, just folded into the silence like she was used to surviving in it. The next morning, word drifted down from the mercantile in the form of hushed gossip. "That Wilkes girl ran off again," someone muttered. "Ought to be whipped for the trouble she causes." Caleb stiffened. Wilkes. He hadn't heard that name in years. Not since before the war, when Silas Wilkes first rode into Dawson Hollow with promises of cheap labor and land reform, only to build a quiet empire on the backs of black and brown children too poor to leave. Wilkes owned half the fields west of town now, cotton, sugar beets, and bones buried beneath both. Folks said he kept orphaned children for apprenticeship and sent them back broken or not at all. Caleb didn't ask questions then. Like most men, he'd chosen the comfort of distance over the sting of truth. But Elsie's bruised knees and hollow eyes brought those rumors into the light, gave them breath and weight. At midday, Silas Wilkes came to town. He rode a black gelding like it was bred for war, boots polished, shirt tucked sharp. His skin was pale as bone, mustache waxed into curled points, and eyes too small for the width of his grin. Folks nodded as he passed. Men stepped aside without being asked. Even the sheriff tipped his hat. He stopped in front of Caleb's shop, gaze scanning the porch. "You seen a girl running through here?" Wilkes asked casually, but there was a clipped edge beneath his drawl. Colored, maybe 12. Wore a gray dress and bad manners. Caleb met his eyes. "Can't say I have." Wilkes chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If you do, let her know her apprenticeship ain't up yet. She's got another 4 years under contract. Fair and legal." He looked Caleb over once, then leaned slightly forward. "Wouldn't want nobody accused of harboring a fugitive now. That sort of thing don't sit right in a town like this." He tipped his hat and rode on, dust rising behind him like smoke from something burning. Inside, Elsie hadn't moved, but her hands were clenched white around the edge of the blanket. Caleb stood beside the doorway, heartbeat steady but low and heavy, like the first rumble of a distant storm. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, shotgun across his lap, watching shadows crawl across the alley and vanish into the dirt road. Elsie slept curled on a cot he'd cleared in the back room, but even in sleep she twitched, eyes fluttering like she was still being chased. By dawn, Caleb made a decision. He hitched his old mule and cart, packed water and bread, and told Elsie to climb in under a blanket. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the tarp, but she obeyed without a word. He took the back roads, avoiding the town square, and rode out toward the chapel on the southern edge of Dawson Hollow, where the pastor and his wife lived in a modest home beside the cemetery. Reverend Thomas Allen was a black man in his 50s with eyes that had seen too much. He'd come to town with a Bible in one hand and a defiance in his bones that never sat well with men like Wilkes. But he stayed, preaching to whoever would listen and burying those the law forgot. "She's one of his," Caleb said quietly once Elsie had been brought inside. "And she's not going back." Thomas nodded slowly. "There are more like her. Wilkes has 2 boys that ride out after sundown. Pick up strays like dogs. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." Caleb clenched his jaw. "How does this go on?" "Sheriff doesn't see it." "Oh, he sees it," Thomas replied. "But his salary gets paid in Wilkes gold." Caleb left Elsie in the Reverend's care for the day and returned to town with a weight in his chest that hadn't been there since the war. That night, he went to the old courthouse archives, keys borrowed from a clerk who owed him a favor. What he found chilled him. The apprenticeship contracts Wilkes used weren't legal. They were copies of indenture forms, decades old and meant for orphans who had legal guardianship through the county. But the names on Wilkes' papers, Elsie's included, were scrawled in with different handwriting. Forged, dozens of them. He took the papers, tucked them under his coat, and brought them straight to the sheriff. Sheriff Halder barely looked up from his pipe. "You bring me scraps of paper and expect me to arrest the most powerful man in this county?" "I expect you to do your damn job," Caleb said, slamming the stack on the desk. Halder's eyes narrowed. "Careful who you raise your voice at, Booker. You're already halfway out of polite society for marrying a red girl." There was no hiding it now. The rot wasn't hidden in whispers anymore. It was bold, smug, sitting behind desks and on horses, and it wore a badge when it pleased. The next morning, Wilkes came again. This time, he wasn't smiling. He stood in front of Caleb's shop with 2 of his boys, broad-shouldered, dead-eyed men with pistols on their hips and rope in their hands. "You've been busy," Wilkes said, voice low and oily. "Spreading lies, forging documents, hiding thieves." "I've been telling the truth," Caleb replied, stepping into the sunlight. Wilkes stepped closer. "This isn't your fight, Booker. That girl belongs to me." "She's not a horse, Wilkes." "No," Wilkes sneered, "but she's still property. And if you stand between a man and his property, it won't end well for you." For a heartbeat, the street was silent. A few townsfolk watched from behind curtains, others from porches, pretending not to hear. Fear made people quiet, but fear had never suited Caleb. He didn't flinch. "She's not yours," he said evenly. "And I've got the proof." Wilkes blinked, just once, but it was enough. The smallest crack in a fortress of arrogance. The boys behind him stepped forward, and the tension on the street snapped taut. Caleb didn't back down. Somewhere behind him, a bell rang. Church, noon. It felt like a warning shot from heaven. And war was coming. Wilkes stepped onto Caleb's porch like he owned it. His boots struck the wood with slow, deliberate menace, each thud followed by the scraping footsteps of his two hired boys. The townsfolk lined the edges of the street now, drawn by whispers and instinct, by the knowledge that something had finally broken loose in Dawson Hollow. Mothers clutched their children. Old men watched with narrowed eyes from rocking chairs. No one stepped in. Not yet. "Last chance, Booker," Wilkes said, his voice thick with confidence. "Hand her over, or I'll take her myself, and burn your little hole of a shop to ash just for good measure." He paused at the top step, the toe of his boot inches from Caleb's. "You think one little girl's worth all this?" Caleb didn't answer. He stood still as a mountain, coat unbuttoned, hat shadowing his eyes. He looked past Wilkes, toward the edge of the crowd, where Reverend Thomas was arriving with two elders from the chapel, and behind them, a thin, wiry man in wire-frame spectacles, the traveling circuit judge who'd come through town once a year to bless records and collect fines. Caleb had sent for him 2 nights ago, on a borrowed horse and a hope. The judge stepped forward now, clearing his throat. "Silas Wilkes." Wilkes turned, eyebrows rising. "Well, look who dragged himself into town." "Sorry, Judge, this here's private business." "I'm afraid not," the judge replied. "I've reviewed the documents Mr. Booker provided. What you've been passing off as apprenticeship contracts are forgeries. Signatures don't match. No county seals. And some of the children listed," he glanced at the pages, "were never legally orphaned. Which makes this not a matter of contracts, but kidnapping and forced labor." The crowd stirred. Wilkes's smirk faltered. "That's a fine bit of paperwork," he said, trying to laugh. "But it won't hold in court. Who's going to testify?" "A frightened little colored girl." "I will," a voice said softly. Every head turned. Elsie stood at the edge of the porch, face pale but steady. Her knees shook, but she stood tall like someone who'd finally found her ground. "I'll testify, and so will Reuben Martin and Martha Lynn. They're hiding in the church cellar. You want to hear how he beat us? How he sold my friend to a rancher down south who worked her until her spine broke." Wilkes turned on her like a striking snake. "You lying little—" He reached for her arm, but Caleb caught his wrist mid-air. The crowd gasped. "Touch her again," Caleb said, voice low and flat, "and I swear on my wife's grave I'll end you before the judge finishes his sentence." Wilkes yanked free, red-faced and sputtering, but now eyes were watching him, judging, weighing. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, holding a hand-bound ledger. "We've got names, dates, bruises. We've kept quiet long enough. But not anymore." Wilkes backed down the steps slowly, a wildness creeping into his expression. His boys didn't follow. They hovered awkwardly, unsure, sensing the tide had turned. "You think this is over?" Wilkes hissed, eyes blazing. "You think a court will convict me in this town?" The judge spoke again, calmly. "The trial won't be held in this town. County Marshal's already on his way." Wilkes paled, and for the first time, the man looked small, shriveled by the light of truth, stripped of his arrogance. He turned without another word, storming down the street alone, his boots kicking up dust that didn't settle until long after he'd vanished around the bend. The silence he left behind wasn't fear. It was something older, something cleaner. Elsie looked up at Caleb. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "You didn't have to do all that." He smiled faintly, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Yeah," he said, "I did." Wilkes didn't sleep that night. They said he paced his porch for hours, muttering curses under his breath and writing letters no one would ever read. The judge had taken the forged contracts. The reverend had taken the children. And the townsfolk, those who once tipped their hats and turned their eyes, now whispered behind drawn curtains and closed doors. By morning, the county marshal had arrived. Marshal Jonah Price rode into Dawson Hollow with a federal seal on his coat and a telegram from the state capitol tucked in his vest. Word had reached farther than Wilkes had imagined. The charges were official now, labor trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, document forgery. But even then, Wilkes didn't go quietly. When a marshal came to his door, Wilkes greeted him with champagne in hand and a sarcastic salute. "Got yourself a posse, Marshal? We're just playing cowboy for the colored folk." Price wasn't amused. "You're under arrest, Wilkes. I'd advise cooperation." Wilkes laughed. "You don't know this town. They'll come around. Always have. Who do you think paid for the church roof, the schoolhouse, the mayor's campaign?" But this time no one came. They took him in cuffs down Main Street. He spat at the judge and cursed Caleb under his breath as they passed. But Caleb stood tall on the porch of his shop, Elsie beside him, flanked by other children who had finally come out of the shadows. And then, something Wilkes hadn't expected. Out from the crowd came a woman in a fine gray traveling coat. She walked with grace but spoke with steel. "Mr. Wilkes," she said, raising a slip of paper, "I represent the Freedmen's Bureau and the Federal Bureau of Labor. We've been investigating you for years. We finally have enough." Wilkes froze. "We intercepted letters sent to plantation owners in Georgia and Texas, offering healthy youth for field work. We matched the handwriting to your contracts. And one of the girls you sold, she lived. She's recovering in New Orleans. She's already testified." The paper in her hand was a warrant, signed and sealed. Wilkes looked around like a drowning man scanning for a rope. "You don't understand," he stammered. "Those kids had nothing. I gave them purpose food." "You stole their lives," the woman said coldly. "And now the law will take yours, piece by piece." Wilkes lunged suddenly, as if he could somehow escape the weight bearing down on him. He shoved one deputy aside, ran, boots clattering over the wooden boards like a wild thing fleeing fire. But he didn't get far. Caleb stepped out into the road, quiet as ever, and simply held out an arm. Wilkes slammed into him like a bird into a wall, clumsy, graceless, final. He collapsed to the ground, gasping. Marshal Price hauled him to his feet. "You'll be transferred by rail to the county seat. Federal court." As they dragged him away, townsfolk stepped out. First a few, then more, watching with new eyes. Some murmured apologies to the children. Others lowered their hats in shame. And for the first time in decades, Dawson Hollow began to shift. That evening, Reverend Thomas held a gathering beneath the oaks near the chapel. Families brought bread and chairs. The children Wilkes had hidden away sat in the sun without fear. Elsie stayed close to Caleb, clutching the folded paper Judge Harris had handed her earlier. A promise of placement, schooling, protection. "You'll be all right now," Caleb said gently. She nodded. Then, after a pause, "So will this town?" Caleb looked around at the people gathering. Not just the faces, but the way they looked at one another now. Different. A little less blind. "I think," he said, "it just might be." The courtroom was packed. Wilkes sat in the defendant's chair, sweat beading at his temple despite the chilled air. The jury stared ahead, unmoved. On the wall behind the judge hung the state seal, casting its shadow over the man who once cast shadows over others. On all charges, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." Wilkes didn't blink, didn't shout. He just slumped forward like air had been yanked from his chest. The courtroom buzzed, but he didn't hear it. His world had ended in silence. They seized his land to pay restitution. The big house on the hill, where children once labored in the dark, was stripped clean, every window thrown open to light and air. His name was removed from the town charter. The bank pulled its funding. His portrait came down from the mayor's office. And when they loaded him into the prison wagon to serve his sentence in a federal penitentiary, not a single soul lined the road to wave him off. Not even the men he paid. Back in Dawson Hollow, the streets felt different. The sun didn't burn so cruelly. The air didn't hang so heavy with things unsaid. At the corner of Main and Clover, someone painted over Wilkes' mercantile sign. Freedom Co-op. It now read, run by Reverend Thomas and a handful of townsfolk who once feared speaking too loudly. The children Wilkes tried to erase now ran errands through its aisles, free and laughing. Caleb reopened his workshop. New planks replaced the ones Wilkes' boys had split. He didn't say much, never did, but his hammer rang louder now, echoing with something more than iron and wood. That spring, Elsie was accepted into the Teachers' Academy in Greenville. The town took up a collection. Even the ones who once turned away gave what they could. On her last night in Dawson Hollow, she stood on the chapel porch with Caleb beside her, dusk draping the sky in violet and gold. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if they don't want me there either?" Caleb looked down at her, his face weathered but calm. "Then you teach him," he said. "What kind looks like?" She laughed, blinking back tears. "Will you be here when I come back?" He smiled faintly. "Always." The town took its time healing. Some still wrestled with the past, others with themselves. Old men at the barber shop spoke in softer tones. White children began sitting beside black children in school, not because a law said they must, but because Elsie had told her story. And stories stick harder than rules. At Sunday service, the Reverend said, "The devil don't always come with horns. Sometimes he brings a contract and a smile." And in the pews, no one looked away. On a quiet afternoon that summer, Caleb found a small package on his doorstep. No name, no note, just twine and brown paper. Inside, a hand-sewn quilt, every patch stitched by one of the children Wilkes had taken. And in the center, embroidered in simple thread, a line that stopped Caleb cold. "He made the world pause long enough for us to run." He didn't cry, but he sat there a long time, quilt in his lap, the sun warming his shoulders. The town never put up a statue for Caleb Booker. But every spring, on the hill behind the chapel, wildflowers bloom where Wilkes' house once stood. No one planted them. They just come, and in their quiet, steady return, they say everything that needs saying. Kindness doesn't roar. It roots, and it rises.